Alright, so not quite as many books as last month, but here's what I read for the month of April. Starting with The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. Now this is book 1 of the Poppy War series, as I believe it is called. I had not read anything by R.F. Kuang yet. Obviously this is her debut novel. Came out a couple of years ago, and Dragon Republic is out already, and The Burning God comes out later this year. So my plan was basically to read Poppy War, get to Dragon Republic in the next couple of months, and then Burning God comes out in November? I might be confusing that with Fires of Vengeance by Evan Winter. Either way, both of those come out later this year. I'm going to read Burning God. Poppy War, you follow Rin, who is our main protagonist. Very, very violent, dark setting. It's essentially she gets into this school that she has no business getting into based on where she's from. She is a war orphan. She doesn't come from a prestigious family or anything like that. She grinds like crazy for months and months and months to to pass this test. During her training there, her and her fellow classmates are essentially thrust into this war that's occurring. So you have a bunch of characters that aren't necessarily ready for war, but they have to be. This war that they get into with the Federation gets super, super dark, and honestly, after the whole school concept and dueling, things like that, all these characters learning their classes, to get put into this war, R.F. Kuang did a fantastic job of not only depicting battle and the magic in this world that has a lot to do with gods. She does what I don't see a lot of authors do, and that is she focuses a lot on the aftermath of war. I say this whenever I talk about this book. The darkest parts of this are her descriptions and the terror left behind in the wake of a battle. So you not only have various types of magic that are used throughout the story, but just sword combat is brutal. And most of the time, you read a book and there's a battle and you hear about the losses, how many people died. You might get a description of one person being in a duel and then getting, cut open and losing. This goes way beyond that. I mean, there's parts of this book where villages or cities are completely ransacked, and I don't want to spoil anything, but just the descriptions of how horrible people can be sometimes to their opponents really shines in this book. And just Rin and the rest of the cast really get a sense of what the real world is like in this story, and how violent it can be and how dangerous it truly is. And the enemy that they're up against does not even view them as human beings, so they don't even consider them worth treating like a person. And that comes through very strongly in some of these scenes where you read about the horrible crap that is done to some of these people. Overall though, I really enjoyed it. It is super dark, and a lot of what I've read this year has been pretty dark, but like I said, R.F. Kuang did such a great job with I would say the characters in this book. The pacing was pretty on point, especially towards the latter part where they're in the thick of the battle against the Federation. That gets really intense. And what's cool too is it's a Chinese setting, which not a lot of fantasy is. She pulls a lot from Chinese history, and she pulls a lot from the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Opium Wars, and just the entire, I guess, realism of this world really shines through because she bases so much of it in reality of China during that period. And I think that just made this book way more interesting than it would have been if it was a typical, Western medieval setting like most of fantasy. So I really enjoyed it. Definitely excited to see where Dragon Republic goes. And The Burning God, I have a feeling I know why it's called that, and I'm very interested to see how this trilogy wraps up later this year. After the Poppy War, I also read the rest of the first trilogy of Red Rising, which I actually have single reviews for each of those books linked up here. So that would be Golden Sun, which is book 2, which is hands down still the best of this entire series. Even now that I'm in the second trilogy, which I'll talk about in a minute, Golden Sun is just such a cool damn story. Really answered all my criticisms of Red Rising book 1. Just super sci-fi space opera goodness in this book. All the character work in here is phenomenal. Pierce Brown makes very, very multi-dimensional characters. Darrow is a protagonist that I've come to adore. Severo and the rest of the cast are just outstanding. I think this is the most involved that I've been in a book series all year long, and that's right up there with Mistborn, which I didn't think anything was going to top that, and that was the first thing that I read this year. Red Rising is right up there. They're neck and neck for me right now. This is probably going to be my #1 series by the end of the year, unless something else just completely knocks me on my I haven't gotten to Stormlight Archive yet, so maybe it will, but I absolutely love this series. I also read Morningstar, which is book 3 of the first trilogy. Definitely one of the best third books to a series that I've ever read. I think this wrapped up the story of that first trilogy perfectly, and it could have ended there, and I would have been completely fine with it. I loved where the characters ended up. I loved how the story ended up. It really grew from Red Rising book 1, where my dog is snoring and I'm recording a video. It really grew from book 1, where you start out with your characters as teenagers and you grow with them all the way through Morningstar, where they are in their early 20s. So they've grown a lot, they've seen a lot of crap. This world is full of fantastic space battles. It almost reads like fantasy, which is great. And actually, I tweeted at Pierce Brown on Twitter because I kept seeing this listed as fantasy, and I was like, all right, is this sci-fi or fantasy? He said it's scientific fantasy, so I said, okay, sci-fantasy it is, cool. The world building, galaxy building really, because this takes place on multiple planets, multiple moons. They go all over the place. The technology in here is great. Pierce's writing from book 1 to book 3, totally different. He grew so well as a writer that I honestly, you could have told me that book 3 was written by a different person to book 1, and I probably would have believed you, because I think he did such a better job books 2 and 3 than in Red Rising that it just completely engrossed me in the story. I was fully engaged. These books are relentless, tons of combat, tons of, I guess politicking would be the word for it. Lots of families vying for power type thing. So like I said, it reminded me a lot of a traditional fantasy story, but it's very much sci-fi, very much in the future. But it was a perfect blend of those two things. So then, of course, after book 3 was finished, I waited a little bit, maybe a couple hours. I don't know. I think it was only a couple hours. But I jumped into the next part of the next trilogy, which is Iron Gold. So this takes place a decade after the end of Morningstar. And like I said, I loved the ending of Morningstar. I think that trilogy stands on its own. It could have ended there. I would have been cool with it. Iron Gold gets even darker than Golden Sun and Morningstar left the story. Which terrifies me, because the characters that I love that survived the first trilogy, I worry that now they might not survive, because now there's a whole nother trilogy that they have to get through. And with this second trilogy, the pacing is still on point. This book is significantly larger than any of the first books. This one, I believe, was just under 600 pages. Yeah, it was just 10 pages short of 600, something like that. Whereas Morningstar capped out at 500? Yeah, so it's over 500. And then Dark Age, which is back there, I'm starting that tonight, is like 800 pages almost. And I don't even know what book 6 is going to be. It might, hit 900 or 1,000. What was cool about this, though, what I really appreciate, is the first trilogy is all Darrow's point of view. It's all first person. And he continues the first-person narration in this story of Iron Gold, but he actually splits it into multiple POVs. And what was really interesting about splitting this story up into multiple POVs is, while even though he keeps the first-person narration, it expands the world so much further than just seeing everything through Darrow's eyes. So you do still have Darrow chapters, which are my favorite, but you also follow new characters such as Ephraim, Lyria, and Lysander. And seeing different points of views in this world really makes it feel more alive. You follow Lyria, who's from Mars. She's kind of a nobody and gets thrust into the story. Darrow is continuing his quest. Lysander has, his story going on, and Ephraim we meet in the story as well. You don't know anything about him going into this book, so seeing these different POVs really makes the world feel more alive, and I greatly appreciated that. I mean, both of these trilogies so far, all I can say is they're fantastic. Pacing is second to none. The character work is phenomenal. I love the plot. I love everything about the story, the politicking, the betrayal, the friendships. The friendships. Darrow and Severo are BFFs, and I love their dynamic together because Darrow is always more serious. Severo is just such a smartass, and I've said it before, but unlike Wax and Wayne in Era 2 Mistborn, where Wayne was just comic relief and annoying, Severo is so dynamic as a character, and also he also brings a lot of comedy, but he's a psychopath and he loves killing, and he's just such a fun character to read about. I love Severo to death. And finally, my last book that I read this month was Malice by John Gwynne, and this book was pretty great as well. So I stepped back after binging 3 books of Red Rising back to back to back. I went ahead and picked up Malice. I picked up Malice because Mike's book reviews are talking about picking this up and reading through this series as well. So I figured, okay, I'm going to join you. I'm going to read through Malice. He blew me out of the water. He's like 150 pages into Valor. The best of luck to you. You're going to beat me to the end of the series. But this book was great. Another multi-POV, more traditional fantasy style book. There's 4 characters named on the back. You have Corbin, Evnus, Veritas, and Nether, but it actually followed, I think it was 6 POVs in this book. Third person, so, traditional standard fantasy. I had read that this was very similar to A Song of Ice and Fire. I really didn't see that many comparisons to it outside of the way that the world is introduced and built around these characters. It's very heavily focused on the character work, as was A Game of Thrones, but there's not that many similarities to it. I mean, there's betrayal and, characters backstabbing each other and vying for power, but I mean, that's been done a million times before. I don't think you can necessarily say that it's A Song of Ice and Fire did that for this genre. It's definitely not as grim and crappy as a lot of The Song of Ice and Fire is. Not that this world is a great place to live in. It's a traditional fantasy setting, but it's definitely not grimdark in the way that A Song of Ice and Fire was. Now, I will eventually have a full review of this, so I'll deep dive into it later on, but I liked most of the characters. John Gwynne definitely has some villains in this book that are just villains, and you want them to die. They deserve to be killed. There's a character named Rafe who really... Okay, A Song of Ice and Fire comparison real quick. He reminded me a lot of Joffrey. He is just an asshole the entire time, and I want him to die. So the other characters, though, are very dynamic. They're not one-note characters. Their motivations make a lot of sense, and I was going to go ahead and say it. Corbin's my favorite. He has a wolf companion. That's awesome. Anytime I play any kind of RPG, if I can be a ranger and have a pet, that's my game, and that's kind of what Corbin is in here, and that's super cool. This was a little bit slower for me to begin with, because like I said, it's very, very heavily focused on the characters, and the plot doesn't necessarily get going until halfway through. It kind of trickles in plot. It's really focused on the characters and their build up to get to that point. But once it hits that point, it takes off, and it does not let up. The last 150 pages or so are a bloodbath. It's absolutely relentless when you get to that point, and the way that it ended really sets up for book 2. And I have them all up here somewhere. They're wandering around somewhere. Where are those books at? They're up top. Valor, Ruin, and Wrath I'm going to read through as well in the next month or two, so really looking forward to that. But that's going to do it for me. Those are the 5 books that I read last month. I really enjoyed them all, which is great because there was a couple of months ago I read Era 2 Mistborn and Elantris and didn't like any of them, to be honest, very much. So I'm happy to say that I liked all these books. Red Rising is my favorite series, that I've read so far this year. Malice is setting up to be great as well. I really enjoyed the Poppy War. So that's going to do it for what I read in April. I will be looking to have a Poppy War review out shortly in the near future, as well as Malice, so look for those in the next couple of weeks. But until then, guys, keep reading.